January 12, 1942. The cold North African morning presses against the thin canvas walls of a British POW camp near El Alamein. The sun rises weakly, casting long shadows over rows of weary men, their uniforms tattered, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Italian soldiers huddle together, whispering about the horrors they've heard of British camps. Japanese prisoners sit silently, eyes downcast, imagining brutal interrogations and harsh punishments. Every footstep on the gravel sends a jolt through their nerves. Every distant clang of a mess tin echoes like a warning. And yet, the smell is not of fear, but of bread baking, of stew simmering over open flames. The guards, calm and deliberate, carry trays of food instead of weapons, their expressions welcoming rather than menacing. A small boyish smile flashes from one of the British soldiers, incongruous with the POW's expectations of cruelty. Confusion ripples through the prisoners. War had taught them suspicion, but here humanity defies logic. In this uncertain stillness, the prisoners face a choice: disbelief, fear, or the first fragile stirrings of trust. By 1942, the Second World War had stretched across continents, leaving entire armies exhausted and nations on edge. In North Africa, the British Eighth Army clashed repeatedly with Axis forces, primarily Italian and German units, across deserts of sand and stone. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japanese expansion had forced Allied troops into retreat, leaving a trail of captured soldiers in its wake. For the Axis, the capture of troops by the enemy was fraught with uncertainty. Rumors traveled fast among soldiers. Stories of harsh interrogations, starvation, and even torture at the hands of the British. In Italy and Japan, propaganda had painted the Allies as merciless, unforgiving, and eager to extract vengeance. Italian and Japanese POWs entered British custody, carrying these fears like armor. Their training had emphasized loyalty, endurance, and stoicism in the face of hardship, yet nothing prepared them for the mental toll of imprisonment in enemy hands. The journey from battlefield to camp was itself a test. Rail cars crowded with men, some wounded, others sunburned or frostbitten, rumbling through deserts, jungles, or war-torn towns. Every passing mile deepened anxiety, every unfamiliar accent heightened suspicion. At the same time, the British military faced its own challenges. With thousands of prisoners arriving from diverse theaters, they needed systems to house, feed, and control POWs while maintaining morale among their own ranks. The Geneva Convention of 1929 outlined the humane treatment of prisoners, but adherence varied across theaters and units. British officers and camp administrators, influenced by both legal obligations and moral considerations, established protocols, sufficient rations, medical care, and relative freedom within the camp perimeter. These rules were a quiet but powerful contrast to what Axis prisoners had been taught to expect. Cultural differences further amplified tension. Italian and Japanese soldiers interpreted authority, discipline, and hospitality differently. Acts of kindness were sometimes met with suspicion. A smile, a warm meal, or polite conversation could be misconstrued as trickery or mockery. Conversely, the British Guards, accustomed to a certain pragmatism in wartime, saw their approach as routine, simple adherence to law, efficiency, and the subtle reinforcement of order. Yet, for the POWs, each act of unexpected humanity created cracks in the walls of fear that had grown during their captivity and combat experiences. By the time prisoners stepped into the camp's open courtyards, their bodies were exhausted, but their minds were braced for torment. Every expectation of brutality heightened the impact of kindness. Here, in these moments before first contact, the stage was set for an encounter that would challenge deeply ingrained perceptions. a psychological and moral confrontation as much as a physical one. The tension of expectation versus reality would define their first hours in the camp, shaping relationships, trust, and the unforeseen emotional transformations that lay ahead. British POW camps were meticulously organized, balancing security with basic humanitarian obligations. Each camp had clear perimeters, barbed wire fences, watchtowers manned by armed guards, and patrol routes designed to prevent escape. Yet within these boundaries, life followed a rhythm that was surprisingly ordinary. Prisoners were assigned quarters, given daily rations, and expected to follow rules. Simple routines that created a semblance of order amid the chaos of war. For Italian and Japanese soldiers, accustomed to stricter hierarchies and harsher discipline, the environment was almost startling in its predictability. Food became a subtle but profound instrument of control and reassurance. British policy ensured that prisoners received sufficient calories to maintain health, with meals including bread, stews, and occasional fresh produce. Mess halls became sites of quiet observation, where prisoners watched the intentions behind each gesture. A tray handed with care, a soldier's nod of acknowledgement, a warm bowl of soup instead of a pointed rifle. These acts were not indulgence. They were strategic, grounded in both law and military pragmatism. Well-fed, healthy prisoners were easier to manage, less likely to revolt, and more amenable to eventual repatriation. Medical care reinforced this careful attention. British doctors and nurses, often operating under resource constraints, treated injuries and illnesses, maintaining the minimum standards required under the Geneva Convention. Disease outbreaks were mitigated through sanitation measures, quarantine protocols, and vaccination campaigns. Prisoners, especially those arriving from tropical or desert environments, experienced a combination of relief and disbelief. The notion that captors could care for their physical well-being, even with suspicion and wariness, conflicted with the fears they had carried across deserts, oceans, and battlefields. Beyond the physical, the British approach engaged the psychological dimensions of captivity. Guards and officers were trained to project calm authority without unnecessary cruelty. Small gestures, a cup of tea, permission to correspond with, family, or a brief walk under supervision, were potent signals of humane treatment. For Italian and Japanese POWs, raised in cultures where obedience, honor, and discipline were paramount, these gestures were confusing yet transformative. Respect, rather than fear, began to infiltrate interactions. The contrast between expectation and reality created a charged atmosphere. POWs arrived anticipating punishment, but found structure, sustenance, and measured kindness. Every measured action by the British staff began to chip away at the mental armor built from fear and rumor. By the time the prisoners fully understood the camp's routines, a new reality was emerging. War could be brutal, yet humanity could still exist within its machinery. This delicate balance between discipline and empathy set the stage for the encounters that would define the prisoner's experience. It was here, in the structured yet unexpectedly humane environment, that the first moments of mutual understanding and the beginnings of unlikely respect were about to unfold. The scene is now fully set, naturally leading to the angles section, where we can explore both the POW's perspective and the British approach in depth. POW perspective. For Italian and Japanese prisoners, the journey to British custody had been suffused with anxiety. Tales of brutality from fellow soldiers, whispers of interrogation techniques, and exaggerated stories of mistreatment spread like wildfire among those captured. Each man carried not only the physical exhaustion of defeat, but the psychological weight of imagined cruelty. Their minds rehearsed worst-case scenarios: starvation, beatings, harsh labor, and unrelenting surveillance. In these moments, fear became both armor and prison. The first hours in the camp were a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Italian soldiers, some barely out of North African sandstorms, squinted at the orderly rows of tents and the neat lines of barbed wire. They expected shouted commands and rifles leveled at them, yet they encountered measured movements and calm voices. Japanese prisoners, steeped in a culture that prized honor, obedience, and loyalty, interpreted every small gesture through a lens of suspicion. A smile could be a trick, a bowl of food, a subtle kindness, perhaps a setup. Their discipline taught them endurance, but nothing had prepared them for the dissonance between expectation and reality. Inside the camp, prisoners observed routines with a mix of relief and incredulity. Meals were offered promptly, quarters were functional and clean, and guards treated them with a formal civility that contrasted sharply with battlefield encounters. Some POWs clutched at small signs of humanity. A nod, a conversation in broken language, a slice of bread handed with care, but remained wary. Trust was a foreign territory, one they approached cautiously, testing boundaries while guarding their own dignity. Beyond the physical, the psychological dimension became pronounced. Men who had faced gunfire and the chaos of retreat now faced the uncertainty of kindness. This unfamiliar treatment prompted internal dialogue. Was compliance safe, or would skepticism save them from unseen threats? Some wrote letters home, struggling to reconcile what they saw with the tales they had internalized. Others withdrew into silence, observing patterns, seeking consistency before allowing themselves to hope. Yet, slowly, the unexpected care began to register. A warm meal became more than sustenance. It was a statement of intent. The British adherence to rules, orderly schedules, medical attention, and structured routines challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about enemies and captors. Psychological tension eased incrementally, replaced by curiosity, disbelief, and the tentative beginnings of trust. For the POWs, this period was transformative, though subtle. Fear and suspicion had dominated the journey to the camp, but each careful action by their captors began to reshape their perception of the enemy. What had been expected as cruelty became an exercise in restraint, lawfulness, and perhaps even empathy. These moments, quiet and observational, laid the foundation for understanding. A bridge between soldier and captor that would eventually redefine the prisoner's sense of wartime humanity. British perspective from the viewpoint of the British officers and guards. The treatment of Italian and Japanese POWs was both a moral duty and a strategic necessity. War demanded discipline, yet it also required pragmatism. The Geneva Convention of 1929 provided clear directives. Prisoners were to be fed adequately, treated humanely, and afforded medical care. But beyond legality, British military leaders recognized the subtler benefits of humane treatment: reduced resistance, improved camp order, and the psychological edge that came when an enemy realized they were not hated beyond the battlefield. Daily routines were structured meticulously. Guards followed established schedules, ensuring security without unnecessary provocation. Meals were prepared with attention to nutrition, hygiene, and timeliness. Medical officers monitored prisoners closely, treating injuries, illness, and malnutrition. Even minor gestures, distributing blankets, granting short walks under supervision, or allowing correspondence with family, were calculated acts of morale management. Every action reinforced the image of a disciplined yet controlled environment, where cruelty was neither necessary nor productive. Cultural awareness played a surprising role. British officers quickly learned that Italian and Japanese soldiers interpreted authority, ritual, and social cues differently. For Japanese POWs, whose military culture emphasized honor and obedience, strict yet fair enforcement of rules resonated more effectively than leniency. Italian prisoners, accustomed to hierarchical military order but influenced by propaganda about Allied cruelty, responded to consistency, predictability, and the absence of arbitrary punishment. Guards adjusted their methods subtly, blending firmness with humanity to achieve compliance without resentment. Psychologically, the approach served multiple purposes. Well-treated prisoners were easier to manage and less likely to attempt escape or sabotage. They became more receptive to repatriation plans and could provide reliable intelligence if interrogated. Additionally, humane treatment sent a broader message. Britain maintained moral authority, distinguishing itself from the brutality attributed to Axis powers. In a war defined by extremes, such conduct reinforced national and military credibility, both internally and internationally. Even in mundane interactions, the British mindset was evident. A soldier handing over a hot meal did so with measured calm, projecting authority tempered by restraint. Officers observed behaviors, noting patterns of suspicion, fear, and gradual trust-building among prisoners. Every gesture, whether official or incidental, contributed to an environment where humanity subtly permeated the rigidity of captivity. The British perspective, therefore, was not merely administrative. It was strategic, psychological, and moral. Their decisions reflected a deliberate understanding of war as both a contest of force and a test of ethical boundaries. The convergence of discipline and empathy would soon set the stage for a pivotal moment, where POWs confronted the unexpected reality of captors whose humanity defied every fear they had carried into the camp. February 2, 1942, morning light spills across the courtyard of the POW camp. Italian and Japanese prisoners gather hesitantly, their bodies stiff from days of travel, their minds braced for confrontation. Guards stand at attention, rifles slung, but the tension is not of aggression. It is of anticipation. The air carries the scent of freshly baked bread and simmering stew, unfamiliar in its warmth, yet unmistakably inviting. The first moment of contact is simple, almost mundane. A British sergeant steps forward, tray in hand, offering the prisoners a meal. Hands hover, uncertain. Eyes dart, scanning for hidden threats. Soldiers whisper to one another in Italian and Japanese, murmuring doubts. Is this a trap? Will there be a hidden blade? The calm demeanor of the sergeant, the measured cadence of his voice, the absence of aggression, all defy every expectation cultivated by war and rumor. The prisoners take the food cautiously, the weight of disbelief pressing upon them. Some glance at fellow soldiers for guidance, silently asking, "Can this be real?" A handful of Japanese men bow slightly, an instinctive gesture of respect, testing the response. The British return nods of acknowledgement, neither mocking nor domineering, reinforcing the camp's ethos of controlled, humane interaction. Small gestures amplify the effect. A hot bowl of stew, offered without fanfare, carries an implicit message. Survival is guaranteed here, but respect must be earned. The Italians, accustomed to strict military hierarchy and conditioned to fear the enemy, begin to register the incongruence. No yelling, no intimidation, no arbitrary punishment, only structured care. Whispers of astonishment ripple through the group, mingling with lingering fear. In these initial moments, the psychological chasm between expectation and reality becomes tangible. What was anticipated as cruelty is replaced with humanity. Confusion, disbelief, and cautious curiosity dominate the prisoners' reactions. This first encounter, seemingly ordinary, is the fulcrum upon which their entire perception of captivity will pivot. The walls of fear begin to crack, and for the first time, the prisoners glimpse the possibility of trust. As the day unfolds, the atmosphere in the camp begins to shift. Italian and Japanese POWs move cautiously through the courtyard, observing routines that contradict every expectation they had carried from the battlefield. British guards walk among them, hands empty, faces calm, offering guidance rather than command. Meals are served on schedule. Medical care is available for the sick and injured. And small courtesies, a blanket for the shivering, a nod of acknowledgement, ripple through the prisoner's consciousness like a foreign language being learned. For many, disbelief gradually transforms into cautious reflection. Japanese soldiers, trained to read intent in subtle expressions, notice the consistency. No mockery, no cruelty, no hidden trap. Italian prisoners, skeptical at first, begin to recognize a pattern of order and respect that differs sharply from the chaotic brutality they had imagined. Conversations in hushed tones reveal shared astonishment, as men compare notes on the unexpected humanity surrounding them. By afternoon, an informal rhythm emerges. Prisoners accept meals openly, some engaging with guards to ask questions or clarify rules. A Japanese officer, previously rigid and silent, observes younger soldiers laughing quietly over a small jest, realizing that camaraderie can exist even in captivity. An Italian corporal tentatively nods at a British cook, a gesture of recognition that is quietly returned. Each small exchange chips away at the armor of fear, replacing it with a tentative sense of trust. The turning point crystallizes when a group of prisoners, led by instinct and curiosity, approaches a guard to request additional blankets for men weakened by cold nights. The guard complies without hesitation, reinforcing the message that respect and care are not conditional, but integral to the camp's order. In that instant, the POWs confront a profound paradox. Their captors, armed and in control, choose compassion over cruelty. By sunset, the prisoner's perspective has shifted irrevocably. Suspicion gives way to cautious acceptance. Fear is tempered by acknowledgement of structured humanity. What began as a simple act of offering food becomes emblematic of a deeper truth: that in the midst of war's cruelty, empathy can survive. The stage is set for the aftermath, where the consequences of this moral and psychological confrontation will ripple through the lives of both captors and captives. In the days following those first encounters, the atmosphere within the camp began to settle into a rhythm that surprised both prisoners and guards. Italian and Japanese POWs, once braced for torment, now moved through the courtyards with a tentative sense of security. Meals were no longer a source of suspicion but a reliable comfort. Guards maintained their disciplined routines, but the prisoners began to see them as predictable, even trustworthy. The initial shock of unexpected humanity had given way to cautious adaptation. Reports from camp officers highlight the impact of these practices. Lieutenant Colonel James Hargreaves, overseeing the North African facility, noted in his diary, "The prisoners' demeanor has shifted markedly. They are calmer, more cooperative, and their respect for our authority is evident. Fear alone does not sustain order. Predictability and fairness achieve what intimidation cannot." Small incidents, such as minor disputes among prisoners, were resolved quickly because the men understood that the rules were applied consistently and without malice. For the POWs, morale began to stabilize. Letters sent home, often guarded in tone, contained glimpses of relief. Italian soldiers wrote of adequate food and shelter. Japanese men remarked on the orderly, almost civilized routines of the camp. News of humane treatment spread among new arrivals, reducing initial resistance and fear. Prisoners who had anticipated violence learned, day by day, that survival in this camp depended less on cunning or endurance and more on patience and cooperation. The physical condition of the prisoners also improved. Adequate rations and medical care led to strengthened bodies and sharper minds. Men who had arrived weak or ill began to recover, able to engage in daily activities and camp work without fear of punishment. The psychological shift mirrored this physical restoration. Prisoners began to engage with routines rather than merely endure them. By the end of the first week, the British approach had achieved its intended effect. Discipline and order were maintained, Yet the camp atmosphere reflected an unexpected equilibrium, one in which respect, care, and structure replaced fear and suspicion. The immediate aftermath of these first encounters had not only preserved the lives of the POWs, but had begun reshaping their perception of the enemy. The impact of humane treatment extended far beyond daily routines. Reports from British intelligence and military observers noted that prisoners, once wary and resistant, became more compliant and predictable. Italian and Japanese POWs shared their experiences in letters, later incorporated into post-war accounts and memoirs, describing the surreal kindness of captors who, in a world defined by violence, offered meals, blankets, and respectful interaction. One Japanese soldier recalled, "I had prepared my heart for cruelty, yet they treated us with care as if we were human beings first, enemies second." This approach carried strategic weight. Calm, well-fed prisoners were easier to manage and less likely to attempt escape or sabotage. The British command recognized that consistent, lawful treatment minimized unrest and reduced resource strain. Morale among guards and officers improved as well. Administering the camp according to principle rather than fear reinforced a sense of professional pride and ethical conduct. It became clear that humane management of POWs could serve both moral and practical objectives. Culturally, the experience challenged deep-seated beliefs among the prisoners. Many had internalized propaganda depicting the British as merciless adversaries. Experiencing organized care, food, and unexpected smiles disrupted these narratives, planting seeds of reflection that would outlast the war. Italian and Japanese soldiers learned that civility and order could coexist with military authority, leaving a lasting impression on post-war relations and personal perspectives. Even years later, historians noted that camps where prisoners were treated according to these principles often produced testimonies contrasting sharply with the accounts of brutality elsewhere. The ripple effects reached families, local communities, and, in some cases, influenced post-war diplomatic and cultural reconciliation efforts. By demonstrating restraint, empathy, and disciplined care, the British had created an environment where trust, however fragile, could emerge amid the chaos of war. As the sun set over the camp for the last time before repatriation, prisoners carried with them more than physical sustenance. They bore the memory of unexpected humanity, a lesson in ethics and empathy that would echo far beyond the fences and barbed wire of captivity. The stage was now set for reflection, a philosophical consideration of what such moments reveal about the human capacity for compassion, even in wartime. War often reduces humanity to numbers, strategies, and tactical victories. Yet, within the confines of a POW camp in North Africa, a quieter form of triumph unfolded. Italian and Japanese soldiers, trained to anticipate cruelty, were met instead, with measured care, consistent routines, and unexpected gestures of empathy. These moments did not change the course of battles, nor did they alter the larger trajectory of the war, but they revealed a profound truth. Even amid conflict, human decency can endure. The experience of these prisoners underscores the complexity of warfare. Victory is not solely measured by territory gained or enemies subdued. It is also measured by the preservation of moral integrity. The British approach, disciplined yet humane, demonstrated that adherence to principles could achieve both practical and ethical objectives. By respecting the dignity of captives, they fostered order, reduced tension, and, more subtly, reshaped perceptions of the enemy. Fear gave way to cautious trust, suspicion to reflection, and humanity to possibility. For the POWs, these encounters left an indelible mark. Letters, memoirs, and later testimonies emphasize the lasting impact of unexpected kindness. Soldiers who had entered the camp braced for brutality emerged with new insights about empathy, cultural understanding, and the power of measured human action. The simple act of offering food, medical care, or a nod of respect became a symbol of what war could have been. Not solely destruction and hatred, but also restraint, compassion, and moral courage. In a broader sense, these moments challenge us to reconsider how we define strength. True power is not only wielded through force, but also through ethical conduct that honors shared humanity. The story of Italian and Japanese POWs in British custody remains a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, compassion can survive. Quietly, steadily, and profoundly. It endures not as a grand spectacle, but in small, deliberate acts that ripple far beyond their immediate moment. The echoes of that winter in 1942 remind us that the human spirit, even when imprisoned, can recognize and respond to decency, and that such recognition, in turn, has the power to transform both captor and captive.